I don't expect sympathy. I never have. That's the first thing I need to say, because if I don't say it, everyone assumes I'm trying to excuse myself. I cheated. 8 years. 8 years with Annie. Nearly a decade of shared routines, shared jokes, shared plans that felt so permanent I stopped respecting them. And when I crossed that line, I knew exactly what I was risking. I just didn't understand the scale of it. I didn't understand how completely a single decision could hollow out an entire life. The affair lasted weeks, not months, not years, weeks. That detail doesn't make it better, but it matters to me because it shows how stupid it was, how unnecessary. A colleague, Jess, someone who laughed at my complaints, listened when I talked, made me feel seen in a way I didn't realize I'd stopped asking Annie for. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself I'd end it before it became real. That lie lasted right up until the moment Annie found out. She didn't scream. She didn't cry in front of me. She didn't throw anything or demand explanations. In fact, she didn't confront me at all. That should have terrified me more than it did. I came home one evening and the house already felt wrong, empty in a way that wasn't just physical. Her things were gone, not dramatically stripped away, carefully removed. Clothes, shoes, books, even the plants she loved. The walls looked bare, like they'd been waiting for her. My phone was silent. Later that night, my parents called. Calm, too calm. They told me Annie had dropped off my belongings earlier that day, boxes neatly labeled. She'd said nothing except that I'd know why. That was it. No message, no confrontation, no final words, just erasure. I spiraled. Anyone who says they wouldn't is lying. I messaged everyone we knew, friends, cousins, even people I barely spoke to anymore. I begged them to ask her to talk to me, to tell her I was sorry, to tell her it was a mistake, that I loved her, that I'd do anything. I sent Annie messages every day, sometimes apologies, sometimes memories, sometimes desperation so raw it embarrassed me even as I typed it. I told her I couldn't sleep, that the house felt haunted, that I missed the sound of her breathing beside me at night. She never replied, not once. Jess saw the messages eventually. Of course she did. That was another mistake layered on top of the first. She was hurt, angry, suspicious, and she had every right to be. I tried to explain that Annie was my past and she was my future, but words like that sound cheap when they're said by someone who's already proven they can lie. Then she told me she was pregnant. Everything changed overnight. The shame didn't disappear, but it got reorganized. Priorities shifted. Panic replaced guilt. Suddenly there was a child involved, a life that didn't ask to be created in the wreckage of my choices. Jess and I decided to commit fully, not because it was easy, because it was necessary. I cut people off, deleted contacts, left the job that had already quietly made it clear I wasn't welcome anymore. I told myself I would be better. I told myself I would never touch another woman as long as I lived. And for the first time in months, I believed myself. Annie stayed silent the entire time. Months passed, no messages, no sightings. She might as well have vanished from the planet. I convinced myself that silence was her healing, not her planning. I was wrong. It happened in the most ordinary place, a shop, bright lights, music playing softly overhead. I almost didn't recognize her at first. She looked different, not in a dramatic way, calmer, straighter posture, like someone who had already finished grieving. Our eyes met. That moment stretched painfully long. She didn't smile. She didn't insult me either. Her voice was cool, controlled. She told me she'd found something while sorting through old drawers, a keychain, one my granddad had given me when I was a child, cheap metal, worn smooth from years of being carried, useless to anyone else, but priceless to me. She knew that. She said I could collect it the following Saturday morning. I hesitated. Jess was due to give birth in 6 days. I told Annie I might need to be at the hospital. She shrugged, said it was Saturday or the bin. No emotion in it, just logistics. I agreed. That should have been another warning sign. My son arrived late, a few days late. When I held him for the first time, everything disappeared. The world narrowed to his tiny chest rising and falling. I cried. I'm not ashamed to admit that. I cried because he was perfect and because I was terrified I would fail him the way I'd failed everyone else. Less than 24 hours later, I left the hospital. I told myself I'd be quick, in and out, grab the keychain, straight back. I even planned to stop by on the way, like it was an errand rather than a meeting with the woman whose life I'd destroyed. Annie opened the door herself. She invited me in. The house looked different, cleaner, simpler. The photographs were gone, the traces of us erased with precision. We sat across from each other at the table where we used to eat dinner together. She asked how the baby was. I answered. She listened. She let me talk. She let me apologize. I said everything I'd been holding in for a year, how sorry I was, how wrong I'd been, how I understood why she left. She didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't accuse me of anything. When we left, she hugged me. I held on longer than I should have, not because I wanted her back, but because the relief of not being hated out loud was overwhelming, because it felt like closure. I left the house believing that chapter was finally closed. I went straight to the hospital, and everything ended. The doors wouldn't open for me. The ward manager wouldn't meet my eyes. A nurse told me my access had been revoked. No explanation, no discussion. I raised my voice. I demanded answers. That was enough for security. I was escorted out while my newborn son lay inside, unaware his father was being erased from his life, one policy decision at a time. I called Jess over and over. I called her mother. No answer. Then my phone buzzed. It wasn't Jess. It was a screen recording. Doorbell footage. Me walking into Annie's house at 9:30. Me leaving at 10:15. A partial hug caught at the edge of the frame. Intimate enough to look damning. Ambiguous enough to be devastating. And underneath it, Annie's message. The words burned into my brain. By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone. That was the moment I understood. This hadn't been closure. It had been a trap. The first thing I felt wasn't anger. It was confusion, so thick it felt physical, like fog filling my lungs. I stared at the screen recording again and again, replaying it as if repetition might somehow change what it showed. The timestamp, the angle, the way the hug cut off just before it could prove anything either way. It was perfect, too perfect. Anyone watching it would see exactly what Annie wanted them to see. I called Jess again, straight to voicemail. I tried her mother. Nothing. The hospital corridor felt endless as security watched me stand there, stunned, holding my phone like it was a foreign object. I tried explaining, tried telling the ward manager that this was a misunderstanding, that someone was lying, that I had been set up. She didn't say anything, just repeated the same line in a practiced, neutral voice. This is a family matter. You need to leave. When the automatic doors slid shut behind me, something inside my chest cracked open. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, didn't drive, didn't cry, just stared at the steering wheel while my mind ran through every possible explanation that didn't end with my life collapsing completely. I told myself Jess would calm down, that she would listen, that once emotions settled, reason would return. I was still clinging to that belief when her mother finally answered. Her voice was cold, not angry. Cold is worse. She told me not to contact Jess again. She told me I had caused enough damage. She said the hospital incident had been traumatic and that Jess didn't feel safe. When I tried to explain, she cut me off mid-sentence. We've seen the footage. That was it. I drove home numb. The next few days blurred together in a haze of unanswered calls, blocked numbers, and social isolation so complete it felt like punishment. Friends I thought had stuck by me stopped responding. Messages went unread. Group chats went silent. I found out later why. Annie hadn't just sent that video to Jess, she'd sent it to everyone. Friends, family, mutuals, people I hadn't spoken to in months, always with the same message, always dripping with cruelty designed to feel spontaneous, emotional, undeniable. The narrative spread faster than I could react. He cheated once, so of course he cheated again. He abandoned his newborn son to sleep with his ex. He never changed, he never would. No one asked me for my side. No one asked for proof. They didn't need to. I tried to message Annie. Against my better judgment, against everything I knew, I typed anyway. I asked her why. I told her she'd crossed a line, that this wasn't justice, that this was destruction. She replied, just once. She said she wasn't going to let me play innocent. She said I might have deleted months of messages, but she hadn't. She said I knew exactly what I'd done. I stared at that message, my heart pounding, because there were no messages. There had never been any messages. We hadn't spoken once since the breakup. That was the truth. But truth doesn't matter when you can't prove it. She blocked me immediately after sending it. That was when the panic truly set in. I went through my phone, my cloud backups, my email, every device I owned. Nothing. No messages, no calls, no proof of innocence, no proof of anything. Annie didn't need evidence. She needed absence. Absence is enough when you're already guilty of something else. Jess refused all contact. When I tried to go through legal channels, I was told it would take time, weeks, months, maybe longer. Family court moved slowly, and suspicion moved fast. I had met my son once, minutes after he was born. That was it. Every night after that felt the same. I lay awake replaying every choice I'd made over the past year, looking for the moment where this outcome became inevitable. I imagined my son growing up without knowing me, hearing stories about a father who didn't care, who cheated, who disappeared. The thought hollowed me out. My mother didn't believe me either. When I finally broke down and told her everything, she listened quietly. Then she sighed in a way that felt heavier than shouting. Her only question wasn't whether I was telling the truth. It was why I'd ruined my life with a baby when Annie had apparently been willing to reconcile. That sentence sat between us like a corpse. I realized then how completely Annie had won the narrative. Even my own mother believed the version of me that fit her disappointment best. The loneliness was total. I stopped leaving the house. I stopped checking my phone. Every vibration sent a jolt of dread through me, even though nothing ever came. I felt like a criminal waiting for a sentence that had already been decided. And through it all, Annie stayed silent. No gloating, no follow-up, no visible reaction. That silence was worse than anything she could have said, because it meant this wasn't impulsive, it was deliberate, calculated. She had waited almost a year, letting me rebuild, letting me believe I had a future, letting me bring a child into the world. And then she took everything. I started seeing a therapist, not because I thought it would fix anything, but because I was afraid of what would happen if I stayed alone with my thoughts much longer. Saying it out loud helped in a limited way. Hearing someone acknowledge that what Annie did was extreme helped. But acknowledgement didn't change reality. The damage was done. I lost my job prospects. Word spreads quietly in industries like mine. No one wants drama. No one wants risk. I was radioactive. Jess filed paperwork, temporary custody, no contact. I wasn't allowed to send gifts, letters, nothing. I stood in my empty apartment holding a tiny baby blanket I'd bought before he was born, realizing I might never get to give it to him. That was the moment something shifted. Not anger, resolve. For the first time since everything collapsed, I stopped begging for forgiveness and started asking a different question. Why had Annie needed to go this far? She'd already won. I'd lost everything once. Why take more? The answer came slowly, painfully, because silence had never been forgiveness. It had been patience. The more distance I got from the initial shock, the clearer the pattern became. At first, I had assumed everything Annie did was fueled by raw emotion, anger, heartbreak, bitterness left to fester. That was comforting in a way. Anger is messy. Anger makes mistakes. What she did made none. Every detail, every timing choice, every omission was too precise. She hadn't reacted when she found out about the cheating. She hadn't confronted me, screamed, demanded explanations, or cried in front of friends. She had disappeared, cleanly, quietly. I remembered how unsettling that it felt at the time. The absence of rage, the absence of closure. I told myself she was protecting herself, that silence was her way of healing. Now I understood what silence had really been: data collection. She had watched me implode from a distance, watched me beg friends to speak to her, watched me send messages she never responded to, watched me lose my job, my reputation, and most of my social circle. And still she waited. I started replaying the shop encounter in my mind, the way she'd spoken, calm, controlled, almost bored. The way she mentioned the keychain casually as if it had just crossed her mind. She hadn't stumbled across it a few months later. She'd been holding on to it deliberately, waiting for the right moment, waiting until it could be used not as a gesture of kindness, but as leverage. The ultimatum wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was necessity. Saturday morning or the bin. She needed me to come at a specific time, a time that would overlap with the most emotionally charged moment of my life, the birth of my son, the moment where any deviation from expected behavior would seem suspicious. If I'd refused, she could tell people I didn't care enough to retrieve something meaningful. If I'd come later, she could claim I was hiding. The trap only worked if I showed up exactly when I did. And I did. I remembered how natural the conversation had felt inside the house, how she let me talk, let me apologize, let me unload guilt I'd been carrying for months. She didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't accuse. She let me bury myself emotionally. That hug at the door, God, that hug, was the final detail. I hadn't thought twice about it at the time. It felt like closure, a human moment after months of silence. But now I saw it differently. She hadn't pulled away. She'd allowed it. She knew exactly where the camera was. The doorbell footage didn't need to show anything explicit. It only needed to imply enough to confirm the story people already wanted to believe. Context does the rest. That was the brilliance of it. Annie hadn't invented a new version of me. She'd simply reinforced the one people already had. The cheater, the liar, the selfish man who ruined a good thing and would do it again. Once that identity is assigned, every ambiguous detail bends toward it. I started to wonder how long she'd been planning it. Weeks? Months? Since the moment she found out about Jess? Since the pregnancy? The thought made my stomach churn. What terrified me most wasn't the act itself. It was how patient she had been, how long she had been willing to live quietly with the intention of destroying me later. That kind of revenge doesn't burn hot. It freezes. I tried again to speak to someone, anyone who might listen objectively. One friend finally agreed to meet me for coffee, though his body language screamed reluctance. He sat across from me with his arms crossed, eyes scanning the cafe as if hoping someone he knew wouldn't see him there. I explained everything, slowly, carefully. I told him about the keychain, the timing, the conversation, the footage, the message. I told him I never touched Annie beyond the hug, that there were no messages, no affair, no relapse. He nodded as I spoke. When I finished, he said, "Look, I want to believe you. I really do." That "but" never even had to be spoken. He told me it looked bad, that Annie wasn't the type, that she'd never been vindictive, that if she said something happened, there must be a reason. I asked him what possible reason there could be to lie about something like that. He didn't answer. Instead, he told me I should focus on fixing things with Jess, as if that were still an option. The legal process moved slowly, as predicted. I filed for visitation rights, for mediation, for any form of contact. Each step required documentation, patience, money I barely had left, and emotional resilience I was rapidly running out of. Jess's lawyer painted me exactly how Annie had framed me: unstable, unfaithful, aggressive. A man who had to be escorted out of a hospital by security hours after his child's birth. Facts stripped from context are weapons, and Annie had supplied the ammunition. At night, I started having dreams where I was standing outside a locked door, hearing my son cry on the other side. I'd wake up soaked in sweat, heart racing, the echo of that cry lingering in my ears long after the room fell silent. The therapist told me this was trauma, that betrayal, especially public betrayal, rewires how the brain processes safety and trust. She asked me if I felt angry at Annie. I told her the truth. I felt small. Anger implies power. It implies a belief that you can still confront, still fight back, still change the outcome. What I felt was closer to erasure. Annie hadn't just taken revenge. She'd rewritten my story without my consent. Every version of events now passed through her lens. Every explanation I offered sounded defensive. Every attempt to clarify sounded like manipulation. The more I spoke, the worse it looked. Silence had been her weapon. Now it was mine by force. I thought about confronting her publicly, posting my side online, releasing a statement, but even imagining it made me feel sick. I could already see how it would go. A cheater claims he's innocent this time. No one roots for that man. I was trapped in a moral paradox of my own creation. I had done something unforgivable once, and now I was being punished for something I hadn't done. And because of the first sin, the second accusation stuck effortlessly. Some nights I wondered if this was karma, if the universe had simply decided that my wrongdoing meant I forfeited the right to be fairness forever, that once you cross a certain line, you lose the right to be believed. That thought scared me more than anything Annie had done. Because if that was true, then there was no redemption arc, no second act, no future where I was anything other than the villain in someone else's story. The only thing that kept me going was the image of my son, not as a newborn, but as a person, a child who might one day ask questions, who might wonder why his father wasn't around, who might search for answers beyond the ones handed to him. I didn't know if I'd ever get the chance to speak to him, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Annie hadn't just taken revenge on me. She ensured I would carry it
without
alone.
shape or distinction. I woke up, checked my phone out of habit, found nothing, and went back to staring at the ceiling. Food lost taste. Sleep came in fragments. Every mirror I passed felt accusatory, like it was reflecting the version of me everyone else now believed in. I wasn't just alone. I was socially erased. Friends didn't just stop calling, they stopped mentioning me. Mutual acquaintances acted like I'd never existed. It was as if Annie's version of events had rewritten the past itself, transforming 8 years of shared history into something embarrassing people preferred not to acknowledge. I started noticing how silence spreads. No one announces they've chosen a side. They simply stop replying, stop inviting, stop including. Silence doesn't argue, it doesn't need to, it just isolates you until your absence feels natural. The legal process dragged on with the same cold indifference. Forms, emails, waiting periods. Every interaction stripped emotion away and reduced my life to bullet points. Reason for denial of access. History of infidelity. Behavior at hospital. Each line felt like a verdict. My lawyer was honest in a way that bordered on cruel. He told me the truth mattered, but perception mattered more. That family court prioritized stability above fairness. That allegations, especially believable ones, carry weight even without proof. Your best outcome, he said, is time. Time. As if time would somehow restore trust that had been surgically removed. I asked him if there was any way to prove the footage was misleading. He shrugged. The video showed what it showed. Annie's message framed it how she framed it. Without contradictory evidence, it stood. The absence of messages, the thing that should have saved me, worked against me. People didn't see it as proof of innocence. They saw it as something erased, because that's what guilty people do. I wanted to scream. I started replaying every moment of my relationship with Annie, searching for signs, not of cruelty, but of capacity. Had she always been capable of this? Had I mistaken her calmness for kindness, her restraint for weakness? I remembered small things, moments I'd dismissed, how she never fought loudly, how she withdrew instead of arguing, how she processed pain privately, how she never needed the last word. At the time, I thought that meant she forgave easily. Now I understood something much darker. She didn't forgive, she stored. I began to realize that what Annie had done wasn't impulsive revenge, it was narrative control. She hadn't lashed out, she'd waited until she could define reality for everyone else while remaining almost invisible herself. No public accusations, no dramatic confrontations, no messy trail, just one perfectly timed implication. And then silence. That silence protected her. Anyone questioning her motives would look cruel, defensive, or paranoid. She didn't need to justify herself. She was the wronged woman. I was the proven cheater. That identity overshadowed everything. The therapist asked me one day who I was before all of this. I struggled to answer, not because I didn't remember, but because it felt irrelevant, like describing a character from a story no one believed in anymore. I had been a partner, a friend, a professional, someone people trusted. Now I was an example, a warning, a story people told themselves about what happens when you mess up. And yet, what haunted me most wasn't losing Annie, it was losing the chance to be better in a way that mattered. I had changed, genuinely. Not out of fear, but out of regret so deep it had reshaped how I saw myself. I had accepted the consequences of my cheating. I hadn't fought them. I hadn't blamed anyone but myself. But none of that mattered. Redemption doesn't exist if no one is watching. Weeks passed, then months. The court granted supervised visitation, eventually, limited, controlled, conditional. It felt less like justice and more like parole. I saw my son again in a small, sterile room with neutral colors and a woman taking notes in the corner. He didn't recognize me. He stared past my face, searching for familiarity I didn't represent. I held him carefully, terrified of doing something wrong, of breathing wrong, of being watched not as a father, but as a risk. When the session ended, I handed him back and sat alone in my car afterward, shaking. That's when the grief hit fully. Not explosive, not dramatic. Heavy. Permanent. I realized something then that I hadn't been ready to admit before. Even if Annie admitted the truth tomorrow, even if everyone suddenly believed me, the damage wouldn't disappear. Jess would never unsee that footage. My family would never fully trust me. My son's story would always include doubt. Annie chose a revenge that didn't end. There was no clean resolution, no reveal, no triumphant vindication waiting around the corner. She hadn't destroyed me loudly. She'd done it quietly enough that the world could keep moving without noticing. And that's when the final, most painful realization settled in. She hadn't just punished me for what I did to her. She had ensured I would never be able to
after
escape
everything
it.
collapses when you stop asking why. Not because you found answers, but because the questions themselves become exhausting. That's where I live now. I stopped trying to convince people months ago, stopped explaining, stopped defending myself. Every explanation sounded like an excuse. Every defense felt like guilt in disguise. Silence became the only thing that didn't make it worse. And maybe that's the cruelest symmetry of all. Annie chose silence as her weapon. Now it's all I have left. People like to believe that truth has gravity, that it eventually rises, that lies collapse under their own weight, that time reveals all things. That belief is comforting. It's also not always real. What actually rises is the story people accept first. What collapses is whatever doesn't fit cleanly into that story. I was already labeled, already categorized, already understood, wrongly but permanently. I became a lesson people didn't need to question. I don't hate Annie. That's the part no one understands. I don't forgive her either, but hatred implies surprise. And once you understand someone's capacity for patience, for restraint, for delayed action, nothing they do feels shocking anymore. She didn't want me to suffer loudly. She wanted me to live with it. I think about that hug sometimes, the way she let me hold on, the way she didn't pull away, the way she let me feel relief, closure, peace. I understand now why she did that. She wanted me calm, open, unguarded. She wanted me to leave believing the past was buried, because revenge is weakest when it's expected and strongest when it arrives disguised as mercy. Jess and I never recovered, even when she agreed to mediation, even when lawyers spoke for us, even when conversations happened. Something fundamental had broken. Not trust, something deeper. Certainty. She would look at me sometimes like she was measuring two versions of reality and couldn't tell which one was real, and that doubt never left her eyes. Eventually, she stopped fighting it. She didn't accuse me again. She didn't yell. She didn't demand answers. She just emotionally stepped away. And you can't argue with absence. I see my son now on a schedule that feels more like permission than parenthood. He's growing fast, laughing, learning faces, learning voices. I am familiar to him, not essential. That's a quiet grief people don't talk about. Being present, but replaceable. At night, I replay everything. Not the cheating, I've done that enough. Not the confrontation that never happened, not even the footage. I replay the moment Annie chose not to confront me. That was the real beginning. That was the fork in the road where everything else followed. If she had screamed, if she had cried, if she had demanded answers, I would have understood. But she didn't. She chose to observe, to wait, to let me build a life fragile enough to collapse on implication alone. And she succeeded. Do I deserve punishment for what I did? Yes. Do I deserve to be permanently defined by it? I don't know anymore. What I do know is this. There are mistakes you can grow from, and mistakes that leave you frozen in the moment they were discovered. I will never be the man I was before, but I will also never be the man people believe I am now. And that space between who you were, who you became,
and who the world insists you are is a lonely place to exist. I've stopped hoping for redemption. Hope implies an audience. Now I focus on endurance, on being steady, on being quiet, on being consistent even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching. Because that's all that's left when your name is damaged beyond repair. You don't get justice, you don't get closure, you don't even get believed. You just live. And if there's any lesson in all of this, any warning worth hearing, it's this. Never assume someone's silence means they've let go. Sometimes it just means they're waiting for the moment your life has the most to lose.